I begin, I have to mention that we were scheduled to have an immunology lecture after this one, but I've noticed that I've got a clash where I have a third-year lecture to deliver at 11. So can we have this immunology lecture on Thursday, 9 to 10? We've got a free slot. Okay? So we'll just have this virology lecture and then swap over on Thursday. I'll put that out in Moodle, the new schedule. Okay? Apologize for that.
Dr. Garwin, if you don't mind me asking.
Yes.
Is it possible to make it a little earlier than Thursday? Because we're trying to finish up the newer material before the final. And as you know, the block is pretty huge.
Yeah.
Could it be like maybe later on today or tomorrow? Because we already have a lot of things scheduled at the end of the week.
Today, your schedule is all booked out. There's a possibility tomorrow of 3 to 4 or Wednesday 8 to 9.
All right. I think maybe tomorrow's a little bit better, but I'm sure that the BLCs will contact you a little further on it.
Tomorrow 3 to 4?
That's for me personally. I don't know about the batch. I think we should ask them and get back to you.
Okay, do that. All right.
Okay. Thank you, doctor.
No problem. So now today, so in the past, last week, I gave 3 lectures where it was just basic general virology, which is very easy in terms of the structure of the viruses, how we classify them based on their genetic makeup, whether it's an RNA or a DNA virus, and that was the basis of the Baltimore classification. And then the third lecture, which was a sort of generalization of the different types of viruses depending on various criteria, such as the diseases they cause, the organs they might infect, bearing in mind that a lot of these viruses are multi-organ systems, and whether some groups of viruses cause particular diseases like hepatitis or cancer. Now, for you guys, a big challenge in those are relatively easy concepts to understand. But a big challenge for you now is to memorize or remember diverse names of viruses and try to compartmentalize them into particular characteristics, because this type of information will be tested for you in your board exams, because the USMLE, in terms of virology, quizzes or tests these sort of aspects of knowledge. For instance, things like herpesviruses are associated with latency, hemorrhagic fever viruses are associated with zoonoses in terms of insect vectors, and so on.
Allah, shuhada, shuhada. No. The funniest clip in Friends, or like my favorite clip. Keith, you know it. It's really iconic. The episode about unagi.
Assalamualaikum. Can everyone mute yourselves, please?
Tell them to know how to play from. But in the song, he goes like, no. That's my favorite part of the whole show. Literally my favorite episode.
Where?
The last thing.
Doctor, can you please ask your TA to mute all participants or that particular one so we can hear you a little clearer?
Yeah, TA is not here. I don't know who's.
It's an option. I think anyone but you should be muted. I think they muted themselves. All right. Never mind. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So this lecture is going to be pretty rough for you because it's a very diverse lecture, and it's basically bombarding you with names of different viruses that you should know about, associated with various aspects of disease and pathogenesis. And these viruses are important because they're common in the community, whether in various age groups such as daycare centers, little children because they gathered in groups in kindergartens or whatever, where they can spread through this common mechanism of the fecal-oral route, where they're transmitting pathogens amongst each other through sharing toys, touching each other, and then they bring it home where the parents get infected. And the parents get sick and can't come to work, so that damages the economy. A lot of these types of diseases are associated with gastroenteritis, vomiting, or influenza-type diseases. And because of that, well, also bear in mind, as we realize now from the COVID-19, is that humanity, even with the progress we've made in medical sciences, we are still powerless against viruses. There is no magic bullet like antibiotics for controlling viruses. Something like HIV infections, the virus that causes AIDS, the big progress in the past 20, 25 years has been the development of synthetic chemical antiretroviral drugs to block the replication process of these viruses. But these drugs are very potent, they're very nasty to the human system. So it's not ideal. So the best tool we have at the moment is trying to boost the immune system, to boost the development of memory cells, B cells to make antibodies. In other words, vaccines. And for this but we haven't managed to make vaccines for all common viruses. But the ones we do have, this is the reason why in all countries and in the kingdom as well, that certain vaccines are mandatory for different age groups associated with specific high-risk activity, right? So, bearing in mind, as I said, that we have this huge range of viruses, all with different properties, and we try to group them into various parameters based on things like, one, transmission. Like I said, a common form of transmission is through the fecal-oral route. Then you can get transmission via blood infection needles and with you guys in the health industry, this is a particularly relevant work type hazard. Other type of transmission is in sexual contact. Then you've got to consider what kind of diseases do these viruses produce. A lot of these viruses target particular organs, like the hepatitis viruses, like the GI tract, where they cause vomiting and diarrhea. COVID-19 is a particular case in point of a multi-system virus because of the receptor that it targets, and these receptors are generally physiologically normal receptors. So this receptor, which is the angiotensin inhibitor enzyme, ACE, is prevalent in respiratory cells, in brain cells, in sensory cells, in heart cells. And so you can get, through infection with COVID-19, hypertension, raises in blood pressure, respiratory problems, dementia, and so on. Biological characteristics of the virus, we already discussed in the previous lectures. A general rule is that if viruses are enveloped, they are more sensitive to being outside of cells, because that lipid envelope is where the receptor is. And so viruses which are enveloped are generally easily inactivated with detergents, because detergents act on lipids. So something as simple as hand washing, soap will inactivate something like rabies virus or even COVID-19. Viruses which are naked, which have no envelope, and this is a large proportion of RNA viruses are like this. These viruses are, large number of these viruses are associated with harsh environments like the GI tract. So the viruses which cause polio or the gastroenteritis, Coxsackie virus, these can survive the low pH conditions of the stomach. We talked in the last lecture about the type of what we call virus-host interactions. So whether the virus infection peaks and then gets resolved due to an immune response as an acute infection, or whether the viruses, because of various properties such as having limited effects on host cells, but generating viral antigens on the infected cells, then stimulate an immune response to kill those infected cells. But nevertheless, some cells still harbor the virus, and so this causes a chronic or a persistent infection. Other viruses, and the key one here are the herpes viruses, have the ability to become latent, so they can shut themselves down and hide from the immune attack. And over time, they will then reappear. A variant of this are the retroviruses. Remember the retroviruses, which can swap back from RNA into DNA. That DNA being called a provirus, which is a double-stranded code for virus, can insert itself into the genome and, similarly to the latency, shut itself down and then reactivate it at a later time. Then we've got to talk about epidemiology. So which viruses are prevalent in which geographical areas? So generally zoonotic infections, viruses which are transmitted through insect vectors, are, as a general rule, more associated with tropical areas. In the next lecture, I will talk about emerging viruses, emerging virus diseases. And this relates to basically ecology. The fact that with global warming, rises in climate temperatures, the changes of environment is causing a big change in the distribution of things like mosquitoes, insect vectors, which normally live in tropical areas, but with increasing temperatures throughout the planet, we're now starting to see diseases which previously were only associated with tropical rainforests, for instance. You're now seeing that in New York, countries in more temperate zones. Another thing, another result of global warming is that in the extreme polar ends of the Earth, which previously have been so cold that the land is what's called a permafrost, where the ground is essentially has been frozen for hundreds or thousands of years. Now these are melting, and bacteria and viruses which have been frozen in there for all that time are now coming up, and they're viable. So whether we get pandemics of these abnormal or unusual pathogens is something to consider too. Another aspect with changes in our lifestyle is that with increasing population, we are starting to invade or set up settlements in areas which previously were very remote, what we think of as jungles or tropical rainforests. In these sort of habitats, the local animals have learned to adapt with viruses such that there's no danger to them. But when humans come in, these viruses can jump species from the animals into the humans to cause serious disease. And the case in point is the Ebola virus, the HIV, which previously is thought to have infected monkeys in simian immunodeficiency virus, but not causing as deadly a disease as AIDS. Now, as I said in one of the previous lectures, the naming of viruses is very problematic because there's no actual system. And as we can see with COVID-19, COVID-19 isn't actually the name of the virus. It's just a popular name that's been taken up by the press. COVID-19 refers to the disease that the virus causes. The official name for COVID-19 is SARS-2-CoV. SARS-2 because it's related to the original coronavirus which caused the pandemic in 2008, I think. That was the first SARS that started in Mexico City. And so it was called SARS because it stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. The second SARS attack came in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, with the MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory virus. And this third one, SARS-2-CoV, is more closely related to the original SARS. But it has around 60 or 70% relationship to the MERS. So one of the biggest as an example of this nomenclature, how loose this nomenclature is, one of the biggest families of small RNA viruses are called picornaviruses. Picorna because pico is Greek for 10 to the minus 15, I think. So if you remember your Greek, you're going from micro 10 to the minus 6 to nano 10 to the minus 9 to femto, which is 10 to the minus 12. Pico just means very, very small, right? So this family of viruses are called pico for very small RNA virus. So these are the picornaviruses, which are very small RNA viruses. And the family of this picoRNA virus causes things like polio, hepatitis A, enterovirus, rhinovirus. So they infect mucosal tissue. Like the virus that causes the common cold, the rhinovirus, that gets spread to the respiratory tract, coughs and sneezes, doesn't cause as severe a disease as influenza. It's mildly symptomatic, it just makes you feel uncomfortable. It's generally non-clinical, not making you sick enough to go to the doctor. Related to this is poliovirus, which is more severe, where it can cause paralysis. Yes. Sorry? Oh. Oh. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so this important family of picoviruses, which are essentially GI tract or respiratory viruses. And so they generally cause vomiting, diarrhea, hepatitis A, which is what also called traveler's diarrhea, because people who go on holiday to less sanitary countries often get this virus and causes hepatitis-like syndromes, where you get you can get jaundice, can get slight damage to the liver, but generally it's a GI tract virus, but it's acute. And the thing about hepatitis A is that there's a vaccine for it. So generally they recommend that you get the vaccine if you're traveling in high-risk areas like Mexico, India, or whatever. The Herpesvirus family is an important family of viruses to know about, because generally these are, well, all of them are latent viruses, so it means that they can stay in the body for the rest of your life. They're all associated with specific types of diseases, but they're all generally multi-system viruses. So herpes simplex 1, which is associated with cold sores, herpes simplex 2, which is associated with genital warts. So both of them affect disease of the skin, but they can also cause brain or abnormalities, dementia, and retinitis. But again, just think of these two viruses more as warts or surface skin type disease. Varicella zoster, another skin type disease, which we know as chickenpox. Have any of you ever caught chickenpox when you were kids? Yeah. So you know how uncomfortable it is, how itchy, because your skin breaks up in these rashes. Now be aware that as you get older and into middle age, that virus can come up again in the form of shingles. Cytomegalovirus is Cytomegalovirus is an important virus in transplantation because many of us harbor CMV in our bodies, but it's controlled by the immune system. CMV is a particular problem in people who receive transplants, because when they receive transplants and are under immunosuppressive therapy, the lack of immune responses allows for this virus to grow up, and it's largely responsible for rejection of the transplanted organ. CMV is also a common associated opportunistic infection virus in people who have AIDS, because with the breakdown in T helper cells as a result of HIV AIDS, there's no more T helper cell cytokine mediated response to keep this virus in check. So someone who undergoes progression to AIDS then has large amounts of this virus raging through the body. Human herpes virus 6, these are two relatively obscure viruses. Don't worry too much about them, or don't worry about them. We don't understand much about them, other than the fact you'll learn next year that HHV6, being a latent virus, can activate, remember this important immune transcription factor NF-kappa B. When this virus is activated in a person with HIV, because it activates NF-kappa B, NF-kappa B can activate the latent HIV virus. So basically, when this virus is activated, it will stimulate the immune system, which will then kickstart the latent HIV to start growing again. So basically, this virus accelerates the disease process of AIDS. Epstein-Barr virus I talked about, which has a tropism for B lymphocytes. So it can infect B cells and cause them to become what we call immortalized, where they will never die. And so they're associated with a lot of B-cell lymphomas. And then Kaposi sarcoma, which is a skin disease, and this is also characterized by its close association with HIV/AIDS, because it's one of these opportunistic infection viruses which come up when the immune system's broken down. So don't worry too much about learning what particular kind of diseases each virus is, but just familiarize yourselves with the fact, with these names, that they're all grouped within these herpes virus group, which is one of the largest groups of DNA viruses in the immune system, and that these are latent. These viruses can undergo latency. So this is basically just what I've just told you about. And then back to this picornavirus, these small RNA viruses. The main ones are hepatitis A, rhinovirus, which causes cold, and the enteroviruses, which infect the gut. Of these, poliovirus is important because of the pandemics it caused in the 50s, causing many kids to be paralyzed or having to breathe with artificial lungs. And this was the first major race to find a vaccine. It was the first developed vaccine, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. Coxsackie virus is a common problem for young parents with young kids because they often acquire this virus going to daycare centers or kindergartens. Don't worry about the echovirus. We have then these three in addition to the Coxsackie virus. This is more associated with young kids. We have three major groups of viruses which cause GI tract infections, but more with regard to the general population, not specifically targeted in kids, but to adults. One of these is this virus which belongs to this Calicivirus family called noroviruses. This virus often appears in the news because many times you will see that a cruise ship has been quarantined or the passengers on a cruise ship are prevented from coming onto shore because this virus spreads amongst closed communities like military bases, like big hotels, cruise ships. And this is through, again, the fecal-oral route where the people who are handling the food haven't maintained proper hygiene, and so they contaminate the food. The whole ship starts to eat the food, gets infected, causes severe vomiting and diarrhea. The other virus which associates with kids, including Coxsackie viruses, is the rotavirus. So this is another big GI tract infection amongst young kids from daycare centers. Luckily, with rotavirus, we have a vaccine available. So in many countries, they don't allow parents to send their kids to daycare centers unless they have documented vaccine against this virus to prevent the spread to other kids in the daycare center. And then hepatitis A virus, I've already spoken about. Then we try to group the viruses based on common characteristics like pathology, transmission, tropism. Remember, what does tropism mean? What is meant by tropism? Sorry? Yeah, so the range, the host range, right? Whether it's the species, the organ, or the cell. And it all depends on the receptor, what type of specificity the virus receptor has for the cell. So these so-called hemorrhagic or tropical viruses are also known as arboviruses because based on the English word for an insect, arthropod. And so this is why they are grouped as this class of insect-borne viruses. They're a huge group, and they can cause things as varied, because they're multi-system, they can cause things from brain, like meningitis, encephalitis, because they can infect the brain. They can also cause really horrible hemorrhagic fevers, where they cause infected people to bleed from all orifices, the eyes, ears, because they can infect macrophages and then also cause disruption to the endothelium. So all of your blood vessels start leaking blood. This is the case with Ebola virus. And because of that, these viruses are very virulent and very contagious. And so this is why the WHO constantly monitors any outbreak. The case in point is the Ebola virus. Remember that I said that another important thing we need to bear in mind about viruses is the the infectious dose. So with Ebola, it's known that one virus particle is enough to infect a person. And this is why it creates such a problem, because where you have Ebola outbreaks, the person dies within 2 days, 2 or 3 days. Families want to wash the body because many of these outbreaks happen in Muslim countries. So the family handles the corpse, and because this virus is so infectious, these people get infected through just touching the corpse. Yes. Yes, because it is transmitted through a vector. Now, we still don't know what the vector is in terms of Ebola, because the closest studies we have with Ebola is that it's transmitted through bats. So the other aspect of these tropical viruses, a lot of them, particularly in African countries, is that they cross species because humans eat what is called bushmeat. Whether the monkeys, whatever they can find in tropical jungles, which are already infected with these viruses. So this is why we call these zoonotic infections, because they involve multiple species before they come into humans. Again, you will learn more about this next year. Don't worry too much about this table, but this gives you a general introduction of how diverse these arboviruses are, and what kind, where they are mostly prevalent. I will talk more about this in the next lecture, but there are some viruses which you should be familiar with or must have heard about before. Yellow fever virus. You all know about yellow fever. There's a vaccine for that. Dengue, which is common in parts of Saudi Arabia. Anyone heard of dengue? No. So if you go on holiday to Philippines or Indonesia, as soon as you land at the airport, you'll see big posters warning you to make sure that you don't leave pools of water in pots or things like that, because that allows for breeding of mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes are spreading dengue. Zika virus. You heard of Zika virus? Any of you who read the news? Zika happened, there was a big pandemic 4 years ago in Brazil, where there was a big pandemic with kids born with microcephaly, small pinheads, because the mothers were infected with Zika virus. The Zika virus caused these genetic abnormalities. These viruses, Western equine encephalitis, are prevalent in the USA. So if you're going to write USMLE exams, you're going to be questioned on this virus. And these viruses cross species. So they infect horses, this is why they call it equine encephalitis, and then jump into humans exposed in farms and so on, and then can cross into cities. Sorry?
Virus transmitted by animals?
Yes. So the virus in a zoonotic infection, right? You get a virus replicating or surviving in an insect vector, like a mosquito or a tick. These arthropods, these insects, can then bite or feed on an animal, like a horse. And then humans which come into contact with this can then acquire the virus too. Or the insect can bite on an infected animal and then feed on the human, and bite the human. So this is why mosquitoes are one of the biggest problems in these sort of pathogens, in addition to ticks. So what I've put in bold here, Japanese encephalitis, West Nile virus. So these are ones which you commonly question on in USMLE exams or in the board exams. So you should know about them, even though they are more prevalent in other parts of the world instead of Saudi Arabia. But you need to be aware of them. These are ones which are common in Saudi Arabia, particularly dengue, Rift Valley fever, and yellow fever. And don't worry too much about the diseases they cause, but just the word hemorrhagic fever, just generally have an idea that if it's a hemorrhagic fever, you will get jaundice, you will get problems associated with blood, whether you get total hemorrhagia. But fever is a common pathological symptom associated with these. Some of these can be life-threatening, others just make you very uncomfortable for 10 days to 2 weeks, but you recover. And these are the list of currently approved vaccines which are commonly used, which you should know about. So if you're a parent with kids, most parents would be aware of the MMR vaccine, because as soon as their kids are born, they need to get vaccinated against these. polio, yellow fever, hepatitis A are more for people who are going to be traveling to high-risk countries. Hepatitis B is very relevant for you people as healthcare workers, because in many places, I think Saudi Arabia as well, it's mandatory that you get the hepatitis B vaccine before you actually go into the clinic to work with patients, so you don't spread the virus because it's spread through blood contact. Rotavirus and papillomavirus, as I said, is common with young children in daycare centers. So at that age group, it's sometimes it's mandatory that they get vaccinated before they can enter schools. And then influenza is more for people my age or over 60s, because they have more chance of getting severe influenza the older you get, because your immune system is reduced. Remember, I talked about with influenza, the influenza virus, you have genetic shift and genetic drift. Do you remember what these two are? These are very important for you to know. So which one is a more severe change? Genetic shift. Genetic drift refers to the annual mutations of each species of virus because of the RNA mutability. Genetic shift refers to the fact that the virus has some segmented genomes. So if you get two different strains infecting the same species, you can get mixing or reassortment of the genetic components to give you a totally novel or new virus. I'll talk more about this in the next lecture, but for poliovirus, we have two types of vaccines, inactivated or attenuated. The inactivated is basically means a killed virus, where the poliovirus has been treated with chemicals like formaldehyde, so it can't replicate at all. So this means that the vaccine doesn't give as good immunity, but it's safer, because the attenuated virus is essentially a live virus, so it gives more exposure to the immune system, but there's a chance that it can back mutate to become pathogenic. And this has been the case with this virus with very, very low frequency, but there have been cases where vaccine recipients have become paralyzed as a result of getting the vaccine. And this issue is what's also debated with regard to the COVID-19 vaccine. But again, I will talk about that in the immunology lecture. Don't worry in learning this table, but this just gives you an idea of generalizations in terms of the importance of these various viruses for different age groups. So for instance, at birth or in the fetal stage, all of these herpes viruses, CMV, herpes simplex, because CMV is what's called a teratogenic virus, where if it infects the embryo, because it can cross the placenta, if it infects a developing embryo, it can cause birth defects, can cause microcephaly, blindness, respiratory infections, because as those organs in that fetus is developing and it's infected with the virus, the virus will interfere with the normal development of these tissues. So you carry CMV for the rest of your life, but it's controlled by the immune system. The same with HSV. Hepatitis B is important because because this virus is so prevalent in terms of chronic infections, a mother can pass that virus onto the baby during childbirth, because the baby can acquire the virus through the birth canal. So that baby can then get infected and become chronic and infected. And so this is why we give routinely vaccinations to babies as soon as they're born from mothers with chronic hepatitis B. So these other viruses like measles, mumps, these are infecting children, and then these other GI tract infections affecting adults and so on. Okay, that's it. So send me an email when you reach consensus when you want the immunology lecture, right? Whether you want it tomorrow or Thursday.